Buenas tardes, amigas y amigos,
Good
y bienvenidos a
afternoon,
esta
dear
nueva
friends.
edición del
I'm
programa de
happy to
Diálogo
welcome
online
you to this
de la Fundación
new
Rafael del
edition,
Pino,
Online
que les estamos
Dialogues,
ofreciendo en la
undertaken by
actual
the Rafael
situación
del
de
Pino
confinamiento.
Foundation during these
El
times of
diálogo de hoy tendrá
confinement.
como protagonista
Today,
al
we
profesor
are very
Joseph
lucky
Nye,
to have with us
con su
Professor
sugerente
Joseph
título
Nye.
Las claves del
He will
poder
be talking
tras la
about the
Gran
keys to
Epidemia, en
global
un
power
mundo
after
cada
the
día
Great
más
Epidemic,
interdependente,
in a
sometido a todo
world
tipo
which
de
is
shocks y
interdependent and
tensiones.
subject to shocks.
Bienvenido, profesor. Es un verdadero
Welcome,
privilegio
Professor.
tenerle
It's
de nuevo
wonderful
con
to have you
nosotros.
with us
Y digo
again.
de nuevo
I say
porque
again because
ya
we had
tuvimos
the
la ocasión de
opportunity
escuchar las
of
opiniones
hearing
del profesor
Professor
Nye
Nye
en su
when he
conferencia del pasado 9 de
spoke
junio de
in
2016 en la
2016
Fundación y que ha
in the
sido
month of
seguida por más
June
de 5.000
at the
personas.
foundation.
El
Over
profesor Nye es
5,000
uno de
persons
los
followed him
pensadores
then.
liberales más
Professor Nye
destacados en
is a
materia de
liberal
política
thinker,
exterior,
a
reconocido
renowned
experto en
expert
el
in the
campo de la
field of
geopolítica,
geopolitics,
las relaciones y asuntos
international
internacionales.
relations,
No resulta,
and
lógicamente, nada
you
fácil
can
resumir sus
imagine we are
numerosas
not going to be
aportaciones y
reading
logros
out the
a lo
long
largo de la que
list
ha sido una
of
intensa y prolífica
awards
carrera
and
profesional y
prizes that he
académica.
has been the recipient of,
Pero
but
permítanme
let me just
destacar solo dos
underscore a
aspectos. Por un
few
lado,
aspects. First,
su vínculo
his
con la Universidad de
relationship with
Harvard, donde
Harvard
ha sido
University,
director del
where
Centro
he
de
has
Asuntos
served as director
Internacionales,
of the Center
decano
for
asociado de
Science
la
and
Facultad de
International
Artes y Ciencias
Affairs
y decano de la Kennedy
at
School of
the
Government,
John F. Kennedy School of
quizás
Government,
su
and
experiencia en el gobierno de
Associate
las
Dean for
cuestiones de
International
seguridad
Affairs at
y
Harvard,
relaciones
Dean
internacionales
of the
destacaría
John F.
que
Kennedy
presidió el
School of
Consejo de
Government. He
Seguridad
also
Nacional del
chaired the
Consejo
National
Nacional de
Security
Inteligencia de
Council
los Estados
Group on
Unidos.
non-proliferation of
Quiero
nuclear
también, como
weapons
no, dar la
and
bienvenida
was
a Álvaro
chairman of the
Renedo,
National
que será el
Intelligence
encargado de
Council.
articular este
Also
diálogo
with us
que
this afternoon
mantendremos
is
con el
Álvaro
profesor Nye.
Renedo.
Es un enorme
It is a
placer para la
true pleasure
Fundación
to
tener
have
a Álvaro
Álvaro
con
with us
nosotros,
this
ya
afternoon.
que en la
At this point
actualidad
in time,
ocupa
he
la
holds
Fellowship
the
Rafael del
Rafael
Pino,
del
Ministerio
Pino
de Asuntos
Ministry of Foreign
Exteriores
Affairs
en el Delta
Fellowship at
Center
the
de la
Harvard
Harvard Kennedy
Kennedy
School,
School,
en la que está
where
dedicado
he
además durante todo este
devotes his
año dentro
time
del Project
to
on Europe and
researching
Transatlantic Relationship, en
the
sus
project
vertientes
on
como
Europe and
diplomático
the
experimentado y
transatlantic
avezado
relationship.
académico, a
He
ofrecer la
offers
perspectiva
a
española y europea
European and
precisamente en las
Spanish
cuestiones que hoy
approach
tratará con
vis-a-vis
el
the
profesor
issues
Nye.
that he will
Por
be
ello, no me
discussing
extiendo
with
más.
Professor Nye
Como
this
digo, es un verdadero
afternoon.
privilegio tener
As
a
I
ambos
say,
con
it's wonderful to
nosotros.
have both of
Queremos
them with us.
escucharles.
We're looking
Álvaro,
forward to the
dejamos en tus
presentation.
manos la
So,
batuta de
Alvaro,
este diálogo. Muchísimas gracias
I
a ambos
hand
por
it over.
aceptar la
And
invitación
thank
de
you
la
for
Fundación.
having accepted to join us at the Foundation.
Thank you very much, Vicente, for the kind introduction. Good morning in the US. Good afternoon in Europe. I hope you are well and in good health. I would like to convey my sincere appreciation to the Rafael del Pino Foundation for its invaluable contribution to academic debate and leadership, and for the opportunity to interview one of Harvard's most renowned academics, Professor Joseph Nye. Throughout my entire career as a diplomat and a scholar, I have deeply admired and been inspired by Professor Nye's work. For decades, he has been a leading light in international relations, a leading light which, today, shines like a beacon in the somber times of COVID-19. One of the greatest privileges of being a fellow at Harvard Kennedy School has been getting to know Professor Nye and benefiting from his profound wisdom. I am wholeheartedly appreciative for the insights and guidance he has kindly and patiently afforded to me during my research at Harvard. The subject of today's conversation cannot be more pressing, and my fellow panelists more authoritative. COVID-19 constitutes the greatest global crisis of the century. The pandemic has unleashed twin crises unprecedented in recent history: a public health crisis with harrowing death tolls and major challenges for our health systems in Spain, the US, and all over the world, and a global economic crisis with rocketing unemployment, public debt increases, and deep recessions, at the least. Each crisis alone is having a tectonic impact on the international system and balance of power as we know it. Almost nothing will be the same after COVID-19, and global stability is no exception. Professor Nye, in your view, what impact will COVID-19 have on the world order?
Well, thank you, Álvaro. It's very humbling to realize that we're only in the first stage of a play that has many acts. So any estimates that we make about what will look like in the final act are bound to be incorrect. It's worth remembering that in 1918, when we had the great influenza epidemic, which killed more people than died in World War I, it was the second wave of the epidemic which killed more people than the first wave. So we still don't know what the ultimate outcome will be. The other thing that's interesting historically to remember is that despite the terrible damage done by the 1918 influenza epidemic, it did not have a big effect on societies and the global balance of power. World War I had a huge effect, but the pandemic of that era did not. So the danger we have is if we try to think that because something is big, as the current coronavirus is big, it's a big event, therefore it must have big effects. But sometimes in history, small events have big effects, and big events have less big effects than we might expect. So this is to say that I am skeptical about people who were telling us what the world will look like at the end of this. Frankly, the proper answer is humility. No one knows. With that said, to give you some broad brushes, I don't think that this is going to be a geopolitical turning point in which China passes the US. I don't think that it's going to be the end of democracy, as some people have proclaimed. I worry a bit about the European Union. I don't think it's going to be the end of the European Union, though the recent German court case gives me worry. So there are lots of important prospects that we can't be sure about. But before we rush off into thinking that the world will be turned upside down because it's turned upside down now, I think the answer is it's too soon to tell.
As a Jesuitic academic product, I fully agree, and I myself tend to shy away from clear diagnoses of the future. We are obviously not clairvoyants, but I very much appreciate your view. And as a Spanish career diplomat and firm believer in European integration, my following point will come as no surprise, as it refers to the EU's response to COVID-19. The EU, as other international actors, has had a rough start in its fight against the pandemic, but its institutions have stepped up significant efforts and still have time to rally. Being a Spaniard and a European diplomat, please allow me to recur to the following metaphor. Throughout history, when dealing with crises, the EU has usually acted like an ill-disciplined soccer team that often goes a few goals down at the start of a crisis, only to snatch victory in the second half, once it starts to really play like a team. Of course, there are significant inbuilt limitations which restrict the capacity for a common response. The EU has limited legal powers in public health and can only supplement the actions of member states. These limited powers have impeded comprehensive and swift responses to an implacable challenge that offers no grace period nor clemency for belated decision-making. As in other moments in recent history, in the face of crisis, the EU is trapped, owing to its limited powers, precisely in the policy field where powers are more necessary, in this case, public health. Furthermore, these limited powers are frequently bogged down by divisions and skirmishes among member states in the framework of a complex and decision-making process which may be deemed dysfunctional, as it hinges on the constant need for consensus. It was Dr. Henry Kissinger who bemoaned that decision-making can grow so complex that the process of producing a bureaucratic consensus may well overshadow the purpose of the effort. Scholarship has designated this the consensus trap, in which the EU constantly finds itself. I've witnessed firsthand this phenomenon for many years from the backstage of the European Council when I was posted in the Prime Minister's office. Senior EU officials have glaringly admitted that the EU has remained politically national, although there has been an important conferral of powers in the economic. By and large, the EU has not been able to overcome its original founding alliance, the European Economic Community. In spite of the unprecedented level of integration achieved in important policy fields such as trade or competition, many other policy fields are, on the whole, still in the hands of member states. Public health and foreign policy are but two examples. Professor Nye, in the face of crisis, and in an era of great power competition, must the EU step up its common efforts and competences to perform more effectively as an international actor?
Well, Álvaro, I tend to agree with your diagnosis of the situation of the EU, both in its causes of some of its limitations, but also in its prospects. I like this image of the team that comes back with a good second half. After all, we've seen, as you said, many situations in the past where the EU seemed to be failing, but there is still a very strong commitment to the overall project of the EU, and I think that leads me to think there will be a strong second half. But I think to get to that strong second half, you're going to have to take some steps which have been suggested, but which are difficult. There should be a major EU recovery fund. I think Commissioner van der Leyen suggested something over €1 trillion. I think that's necessary and perhaps not even sufficient. I also think there should be EU bonds, which would be, George Soros has suggested that they be something like the perpetual bonds rather than adding to debt. I think this would be a step in the right direction. And I think that it's not out of the question that this could be done. But as you said, right now the response hasn't been as strong as it needs to be. So I share the sort of the faith that the EU will pull something out based on the fact that it's done it in the past. But I confess that there are still some pretty hard decisions to have to be made to justify that faith.
I definitely share your hope and your faith. Ambassador Nick Burns interviewed the other day Professor Sergio Fabrini, who I know you are acquainted with, and myself. And Ambassador Burns asked us whether, as Europeans, whether we had perceived that the EU had fallen to the eyes of the citizens during the COVID-19 crisis. Indeed, many have lamented the EU's tendency to default to national solutions, precisely in what should be our finest hour. It was President Macron who went as far as saying recently that the EU faces an existential threat. And I must say, to my chagrin, that I agree. As a consequence of this crisis, a sense of betrayal has deepened among citizens from the most affected countries, like Italy or Spain. In a survey conducted recently in Italy, 67% of respondents said they believe being part of the EU was a disadvantage to the country, up from a 47% in 2018. For Enrico Letta, who has been a speaker, by the way, here at the Rafael del Pino Foundation, and with whom I have had the honor to work with, warned recently that if the EU did not support Italy enough, the country could become the Hungary of the Euro area, a troublemaker railing against the mainstream inside the bloc's single currency zone. This is extremely concerning. Of course, Professor Nye, dwindling public support to the EU is not a new phenomenon. Already during the economic and financial crisis which triggered in 2008, the EU's inability to react swiftly undermined her credibility among citizens. But I would point out two main differences now. The first is that, unlike in the years after 2008, public opinion is now fully aware, has learned almost heuristically, as a consequence of Brexit, that it is not from the EU. And the second difference is that Eurosceptical populist parties have continued to mushroom and gain terrain in national parliaments and also in the European Parliament, as Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart from Harvard Kennedy School have substantiated eloquently for years. So, Professor Nye, what's your view on this? Is nationalism a peril that lies within the EU's fragmentary response to COVID-19?
Nationalism is a very constant problem, but remember, it's been there for a long time. I always think back to the fact that how leaders deal with nationalism can turn it from a negative force into a more positive force. I think back to the extraordinary decisions taken by Jean Monnet in the aftermath of World War II, where it would have been very easy to have tried to separate the Ruhr and Saar from Germany again and to hold Germany back. After all, Germany had just invaded France for the third time in 70 years. And Monnet had the good sense to realize that this would just stimulate German nationalism again. And that if they could think of a plan to take Europe and coal and steel resources and share them, that you would not have that type of nationalism. And indeed, that's what happened. German nationalism, as it developed in the post-Cold War, post-World War II period, identified itself with Europe. A politician who wanted to stand up for a strong national Germany had to be European. And in that sense, what we should be looking for now is leaders who don't deny nationalism. Every country has national feelings. It's leaders who channel that nationalism in directions which are positive. In other words, I've written a book recently called Do Morals Matter? And I raise this question of what can one say about Donald Trump's America First? And the answer is every country has to say his or her country's interests first. Macron has to say France first. The difference is not whether a leader who is elected to be a trustee for the people says that he or she will defend the nation's interests first. It's how do they define those interests? That's where the moral element comes in. And that's where great leaders say, yes, I can defend my nation's interests, but I have to put it in a larger context that includes the interests of others. In the case of the United States after World War II, that meant the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was good for Americans, but it was good for Europeans as well. It means that today, and to go back to my example of Jean Monnet, but also Adenauer and de Gasperi, and Schuman, one should realize that they were defending their national interests, but they saw it as part of a larger or broader European interest, and that the two weren't antithetical, they could be combined. And I think that's what we need is leaders today who say, yes, this is a huge crisis. We have to defend the interests of those who elected us. But the best way to defend them is not in opposition to Europe, but in strengthening Europe, in defining our interests in this broader sense as part of Europe. And I think that's what I'm looking for in terms of when I talked about my hopeful views on Europe.
Well, please allow me to deep dive a little bit more into this issue. As in other moments of crisis throughout history, COVID-19 has indeed, as you referred to, unleashed at its initial stage national forces and inward-looking reactions. And I completely agree that this is understandable in a similar way that this is a metaphor Nicholas Burns always uses. When an aircraft cabin becomes depressurized, people must first put on their masks before helping other people around them to put on theirs. The nation state is still the core actor and unit in international society and public international. Fully acknowledging this, unorderly reactions to the pandemic are dysfunctional, as the pandemic is quintessentially a cross-border challenge, which requires cross-border coordination. And solidarity is a key issue as well, and taps very well into the theme of your book. Governments have prioritized their interests, even if this has undermined solidarity with other countries. For example, certain governments have introduced limits on exports of protective medical equipment, such as face masks, despite severe shortages elsewhere. This recalls similar self-interest dynamics evident during the H1N1 influenza pandemic in 2009, when several member states stockpiled vaccines and antivirals, declining to share them with other countries. Professor Nye, in your view, will the preeminence of the nation state be the norm in the 21st century? Or will we someday witness effective, concerted international actions to address global challenges in which absolute gains are at stake?
Well, I don't think we should expect nation state to be replaced in the 21st century. I think just to be realistic about it, people's strong sense of national identity is not going to evaporate or be greatly diminished. But that may be the wrong way to think about it. Rather than think about replacing nationalism or replacing the nation state, we should be thinking about how do we incorporate it in a broader framework so that it doesn't have quite the limiting period effects that it has when you look back over the past. I mean, there have been times when nationalism supports democracy, when it is a positive force. There are other times when nationalism undercuts democracy, when it's been a very negative, xenophobic force. And I think the key role for leaders is to frame national interests in terms of broader institutions so that it's not either or, but both. Steve Bannon, who was one of President Trump's advisors in 2016, talked about the difference between what he called real national Americans and rootless cosmopolitans. In practice, humans are capable of multiple loyalties at the same time. We feel part of our families, we feel part of our regions, we feel part of our nations, we feel part of our professional groups, our religious groups, and so forth. We're capable of having multiple loyalties at the same time. It's not either or. And in that sense, I think the key question will be for leaders to define strong national positions, but as part of Europe, and then beyond Europe as part of a larger world. My complaint about the behavior of President Trump during this crisis is that he's taken a very narrow view of American interests. Withdrawing from the World Health Organization, for example, or withdrawing funding from it, is a disastrous type of response. And trying to put the blame on whether China or the U.S. had a worse record in the early stages of the crisis, this gets nobody anywhere. So I think the key question is leaders who will take what I call that Monet type approach, rather than the type of approach we're seeing today from President Trump.
No, I fully agree. And just to clarify, by no means do I advocate overcoming the nation state. My hope is that the nation state and realpolitik and raison d'etat and national interest may cease to be an obstacle for effective concerted international action when absolute gains are at stake. And this leads me to the compelling question which lies in the title of your book, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. By the way, the last time we met at your office at the Belfer Center, as you may recall, I forgot to bring the book along so you could sign it. And then COVID-19 struck and the campus closed, and we haven't been able to meet in person since. So I will take advantage of today's opportunity to pose a question I've been meaning to ask you ever since. What lessons can be drawn from COVID-19 crisis in terms of the importance of morals in foreign policy?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that in the COVID-19 crisis is that in the presence of great fear, people turn inward. That's natural, but they don't have to stay turned inward. Imagine, I've written a column for Project Syndicate on this, which I call an abysmal failure of leadership. Imagine that President Trump, instead of first denying the reality of the crisis and then trying to shift the blame onto the Chinese, and President Xi Jinping, who did the same thing, first denied the reality and then tried to shift the blame again. Suppose these two leaders had approached Europe and Japan and Australia and others and said, let's jointly promote a COVID fund under the United Nations, a massive fund that will be available to all poor countries. And then you say, well, yes, but why would somebody, a national of one of these countries, of one of the leading countries, agree to that? And the answer would be because it's both in our interest and humanitarian at the same time. If the COVID virus is not properly dealt with in the poor southern half of the globe, and that becomes a reservoir, and that reservoir spills northward on a seasonal basis year after year, that's not in our interests. It is not in their interests. If the leadership had said, instead of trying to assign blame, suppose we jointly have an emergency meeting of the Security Council or of the Group of 20 and pledge major funds for poor countries to deal with COVID, we all would be a lot better off. That's a case where you define the national interest with a moral content to it. Doesn't mean you're saying it's not in our interest. It is. That's how you have to sell it to your own people. But you sell your own people on the idea that it's a broader version of your national interest. I was interested that Henry Kissinger had a piece in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago arguing that we needed something like a Marshall Plan. And I think that's an illustration of how, had these leaders risen to the occasion, you could have made a major change in international politics. I'm afraid we missed that opportunity, but if there are more waves of the virus, perhaps it will come back.
Well, let's hope that leaders around the globe heed these words. Another fundamental issue I would like to ask you about is transatlantic dialogue. As you know, this has been the overriding theme in my research activities at Harvard. We haven't had a US-EU summit since 2014. During the COVID-19 crisis, US travel bans vis-a-vis Europe were adopted without prior consultation with the EU, and Brussels, understandably, wasn't entertained. Paraphrasing Simon and Garfunkel's famous 1970 hit, do we have over the Atlantic a bridge over troubled water or just troubled water? How can we overcome, Professor Nye, the current impasse in EU-US relations?
Well, I agree with your description of the situation, which is we've had a very bad spell of transatlantic relations in the last 3 years. I think there were some difficulties in the relationship before the election of President Trump, but it's also true that Trump is the first president who has, in the period after 1945, who has been skeptical of alliances and multilateral institutions. And I think if he is replaced in November, that should be a prospect for beginning to repair that bridge. Otherwise, I think we'll be stuck just with the troubled waters.
Well, as you know, Professor Nye, I've interviewed senior government officials from the Trump, Obama, W. Bush, and Clinton administrations to identify fissures of inefficiency in transatlantic dialogue, which in effect predates the current administration, and explore ways to foster effectiveness within channels of diplomatic interlocution. One possibility I am researching is the convenience of promoting in Europe the creation of special envoys, high representatives, or ambassadors at large, to act as references or focal points for specific crises. This would perhaps mitigate the uncertainty as to who to call in Europe, recurring to one of the most famous fake quotes in history, attributed to Henry Kissinger, who actually never said it. But as the Italians would say, se non è vero è ben trovato. If it isn't true, it's well conceived. Of course, for such an exercise to work, the high representatives or ambassadors at large would need to be high profile, respected figures who could coordinate effectively ad intra, creating strategic unity within EU institutions and member states, as well as ad extra, acting as effective interlocutors with authorities of third-party countries. The case of former High Representative Javier Solana demonstrates that such figures are not at all pipe dreams. More recently, and in a completely different context, the appointment of Michel Barnier as Mr. Brexit and his chief negotiator half of the EU, and as Brexit explainer to the world, proves that the EU is really committed to an endeavor it is able to deliver. And one can legitimately ask, does the EU need more Barniers or Solanas? And the question is far from rhetorical, as its importance goes well beyond transatlantic dialogue. It was Madeleine Albright who, in a mood of exasperation in 1998, said that in order to truly understand the European Union, to fully grasp their essence and rationale, one has to be either a genius or French. This is an exaggeration, but there is some truth to it. The US has trouble in the complex rationale and function of the EU as an international actor in crisis management. It could well be presumed that other great powers, such as China or Japan, to put two examples, may have similar issues. In sum, The EU faces, in my view, a credibility test not only for the US, but also before the rest of the world. Professor Nye, to what extent does, in your opinion, human agency and effective personal leadership make a difference in the management of international crises? Is the outcome preordained, or can people really make a difference?
Well, I think you're, again, on the right track. I liked your idea of having high-level personal relations, envoys, perhaps, who are not attached to a particular bureaucracy. I mean, you have with the European Diplomatic Service some very able people, but it's a little different when you're going into another government, bureaucracy to bureaucracy, as opposed to going in at a high level where you know the person that you're talking to has the ear of the prime minister or the chancellor, and can really convey messages in a way that are not necessarily worked up through the bureaucracy. So in that sense, one could think, as you suggested, of supplementing the diplomatic service by high-level envoys. I mean, it is interesting how effective Javier Solana was, but this was because of his personal stature and standing, and it was before basically you had the full apparatus of the European diplomatic service, which doesn't mean that they have to be antithetical to each other. You can have both, but you may need to supplement one with the other.
Well, we have time for one question from the audience. Moraleda, president of Talento Farmacéutico School, has a question for both speakers. How do you see risks to EU to be weakened with regard to the US and China? And to what extent would the euro disappear in the short, medium term? Professor Nye, would you like to share your view on this timely issue?
Well, I think that if you look at the world in a very broad sense, China is a rising power. It's the world's second largest economy, although the national economy, that I should point out that when Europe acts as an entity, Europe is still the size of the US in terms of economic strength. But the most important thing to my mind is that no two parts of the globe share more basic values than the United States and Europe. And China should deserve credit for what it's done, raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but it still has a very authoritarian approach to the use of technology, to the control of people. And the US and Europe have a different approach. We differ with each other from time to time, but basic values, the US and Europe really have a lot to be said in common. And in that sense, I would think that, the danger would be China splitting or trying to split Europe from the US based on economic incentives. I think the Europeans see this and realize that there are larger values at stake, and that's why maintaining a US-European alliance is so important. I don't see China surpassing the US, but I think if the US and Europe hold together, even more important, I don't see authoritarianism surpassing democracy. And so I think the answer to this is for the Europeans to work closely together, closely with the US. To go back to what we said earlier, I worry more about fragmentation or divisions inside Europe. And I mentioned earlier this danger of the German case differing from the European Court of Justice. This sort of thing worries me more, frankly, than the rise of Chinese power, because I think that if the Europeans hold together and the U.S. and the Europeans hold together, then I think I remain optimistic about the future.
Well, the master has spoken, and little could I add. I'm personally reluctant to see the current shift from a zero-sum game. There are definitely absolute losses in terms of both hard and soft power. I mean, I think we're all going to be weakened as a consequence of COVID-19. And even if China has a head start in its recovery, as it seemingly contained the virus relatively quickly, although of course the fierce subject to debate, its power has been immense compromised, as it was the origin of the pandemic. President Trump tirelessly this. There has been controversy both outside and inside of China regarding information censorship by the Chinese authorities. Regarding the euro, obviously I'm an Orient, but in the light of my experience in the Spanish Prime Minister's office during the past economic and financial crisis, I believe that the euro will live on. Necessary action and reforms will have to be put in place in diverse fields. Jean Monnet wrote that the EU was forged precisely through crises. The ECB has a lot of firepower, and different funds have been put in place. Of course, last week's ruling by the German Constitutional Court is unsettling, but not so much in terms of monetary or fiscal policy as in legal and political terms. State Court of Justice, the pinnacle in the EU's judicial system, has been apparently challenged from a member state. I've been intensely working on this issue, and we could hold many seminars just on this. But in a nutshell, I'll say that the EU is at a critical moment as a legal construct, even as a political construct, not so much as an economic construct. Now, would you like to add anything? You, of course, have the final word.
I will go back to what we started with, which is at this stage, there's so much we don't know about the virus or about the depth of length of the economic disruption that we should be cautious in any of our projections, and remember that phrase of humility. But underneath it all, I still have a faith that Europe will hold together and that the Atlantic will hold together. So though we have to be humble, we don't know what will happen. I think we have a lot of history as well as important values that can point in the direction of optimism.
In honor of Harvard's long-standing reputation for effective time management, I'm afraid we have up. Thank you very much once again to the Rafael del Pino Foundation, embodied in Vicente, for this opportunity. And thank you very much to Professor Nye for his invaluable insights and words of wisdom. Shed light on the path forward in these trying times. Take care and stay safe.
Muchas gracias, Álvaro.
Thank you very much, Álvaro. Thank you very much, Professor Nye. Dear friends, the time has come to put an end to this session. Unfortunately, I'm sure you'll agree with me that this has been a very interesting dialogue. I do apologize for that technical glitch, which made it very difficult to understand Álvaro Renedo in his final comments. Fortunately, Professor Nye was able to hear him and was able, therefore, to provide a response. So Thank you very much. Thank you for accepting the invitation. It was wonderful having you with us, Professor and I. It was wonderful to hear about the keys to global power after the coronavirus pandemic. And thanks to all of your good selves for having been with us today. And let me remind you that next year, Professor Niles from the University of Cologne will be addressing us. This is a conference which is called Coronavirus and the Economy, Major Challenges. So this will be next week. As always, we look forward to